The door of the gable mercantile closed behind Alara with a soft, final click. It was the sound of a life ending. In her palm were $4 silver, the final settlement from her late husband's brother. It was not an inheritance, it was a dismissal. Thomas Gable, a man whose face was a permanent ledger of slights and profits, had made it clear. The family home was his now. The small savings were his. Her husband's tools, his rifle, his memory, all were now property of the Gables of Silver Creek. She was 24, a widow of 2 months, and an outcast. All she had left was a deed, a piece of paper Thomas had sneered at as he'd pushed it across the counter. It was for a tract of land her husband had bought in a fit of optimism, a place everyone knew was worthless. It was a played-out gravel pit, 5 acres of rock and scrub on the wind-scoured shoulder of Hangman's Hill, a place where nothing grew and the wind never stopped. A monument to my brother's foolishness, Thomas had called it. Your burden now. He had smiled then, a tight, merciless stretching of his lips. It was a punishment, and they both knew it. The community of Silver Creek watched her from behind curtains and through the steam of the blacksmith's forge. They saw a woman stripped bare. Pity was a thin gruel they offered, mixed with a healthy dose of judgment. Pastor Miller had suggested she take a position as a laundress for the mining camp up north. Martha Davies, whose husband owned the largest ranch, offered her a cot in their drafty attic in exchange for mending and cleaning, a position just a short step from indentured servitude. Each offer was a cage, a life of dependence on the whims of others. She stood on the boardwalk, the deed crinkling in her fist. The $4 felt impossibly heavy and impossibly light. They were everything she had. She could buy a ticket on the next stagecoach east, back to a world she barely remembered, a world that had no place for her. Or she could buy an axe. She looked from the mercantile, with its smug owner framed in the window, toward the grim silhouette of Hangman's Hill. She would not run. She would not beg. She turned her back on the town and walked toward the tool shed at the edge of the settlement, the wind already pulling at the hem of her worn dress. This land was hers. The word felt foreign, but it was the only thing she owned. The journey was a brutal lesson in weight and distance. The axe she bought from a retiring woodcutter cost her one of her $4. With the rest, she purchased a sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, a small cast-iron pot, and a length of rope. She carried it all on her back. The road to Hangman's Hill was not a road at all, but a forgotten track that dwindled into a deer trail. The autumn air, crisp in the valley, grew teeth as she climbed. The wind was a physical thing, a bully that pushed and shoved, trying to drive her back toward the hollow comfort of the town. By the time she reached the property line, marked by a single rotting fence post, her shoulders screamed and her legs burned. And then she saw it. The gravel pit was worse than she had imagined. It was a raw wound in the earth, a wide, shallow bowl scooped out of the hillside, perhaps 50 feet across. The floor was a mess of loose stone and pale, dead-looking dirt. The back wall was a 30-foot cliff of exposed granite and shale, fractured and grim. Nothing grew here but a few defiant weeds and a stunted, wind-twisted pine that clung to the rim like a desperate man. A wave of cold despair washed over her, so profound it nearly buckled her knees. The town was right. Thomas Gable was right. This was a place of ruin, a boneyard. The wind howled over the lip of the pit, a mournful, endless cry. She sank onto a large, flat stone, the weight of her pack pinning her down. Tears she had refused to shed in front of the town now stung her eyes, freezing on her cheeks. This was it. This was the end of her life. A hole in the ground. She was a fool, just as they all said. She sat there for an hour as the sun bled out behind the western peaks, the cold seeping into her bones. The pit grew dark, a basin of shadows, but as the last light faded, she noticed something. The relentless wind, the one that had tormented her all the way up the hill, did not reach the bottom of the pit. Down here the air was still. She stood up, her muscles protesting, and walked toward the back cliff face. The stone, which had absorbed the weak afternoon sun, radiated a faint residual warmth. It was a whisper of heat, but it was there. She pressed her raw palm against the granite. It was solid. It was real. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom. Near the base of the cliff, tucked into a deep fissure, she saw a dark patch of soil, damp and black. She knelt, her fingers pushing past the loose gravel. The ground beneath was cool and moist. Following the fissure with her hands, she found its source, a slow, steady drip of water, clear and cold, weeping from the rock itself. It was barely a trickle, but it was constant, still air, stored warmth, water. These were not the things one found in a wasteland. Despair did not vanish, but a new feeling pushed up through it, hard and sharp as a root through rock, a grim, defiant resolve. This was not a grave, it was a foundation. The first week was a blur of brutal, punishing labor. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and cooking, were her first casualty. They blistered on the first day of swinging the axe, bled on the second, and by the third had become raw, swollen claws. She felled the stunted pines and tough cedars that grew in the gullies around the pit, learning the rhythm of the blade, the way to use her body's weight to drive it deep. Every muscle screamed. She worked from the first gray light of dawn until her arms would no longer lift the axe, then collapsed into a makeshift lean-to of branches wrapped in her thin blanket, shivering not just from cold, but from sheer exhaustion. Her plan was simple because it had to be. She would not build a cabin on the exposed hillside. She would build into the hill itself. She chose the most solid section of the cliff face as the back wall of her home. It was a wall nature had already built, a massive shield against the northern winds. Using the fallen logs, she began to lay out the side walls, extending them from the cliff face out into the pit. The work was agonizingly slow. The logs were heavy, awkward. She had no horse, no ox, only her own strength. She used her rope and smaller logs as levers and rollers, inch by inch, dragging the timber into place. The stones were her second great labor. The floor of the pit was littered with them, from fist-sized rocks to boulders she could barely move. She began to sort them, creating piles by size. The largest became the foundation for her log walls. The smaller, flatter ones she began to stack against the outside of the logs, creating a second, outer wall of stone. She was building a fortress, not a cabin. She worked with a silent, focused fury, her world shrinking to the heft of a rock, the bite of the axe, the ache in her back. There was no time for grief or fear. There was only the next log, the next stone. She began to construct the systems that would keep her alive. The water seep was her first priority. Using the stickiest clay she could find near the spring, she dug a shallow basin at the base of the cliff and lined it thickly, packing it down until it held water. Every morning the small cistern was full. It was her first victory, a small miracle of clear, sweet water that she did not have to haul from a distant creek. It was life, weeping from the stone. Next came heat. She knew a simple fireplace would not be enough to fight the mountain winter. She needed to capture its warmth. Against the solid granite of the back wall, she built a massive hearth and chimney stack from the flattest stones she could find, mortaring them together with a mixture of clay, sand, and ash. The hearth was deep and wide, and the stone wall behind it was immense. Her theory, learned from a passage in an old almanac, was that the fire would heat the stones, and the stones would heat the rock wall behind them. The cliff itself would become a giant, slow-burning ember, radiating warmth back into her dwelling long after the fire died down. It took her 3 weeks of painstaking work, her fingers scraped raw from fitting the stones together. The roof was the greatest challenge. She laid thick logs across her 2 walls, then covered them with a dense layer of pine boughs. On top of that, she shoveled dirt and gravel from the pit, piling it a foot thick. It was an earth roof, heavy and solid, insulated by its own mass. It sloped gently from the top of her walls down to the ground, so that from the side her home looked less like a building and more like a simple mound of earth, a natural feature of the landscape. She left a small opening for a window, which she would cover with a stretched deer hide when the time came, and a larger one for a door, which she fashioned from 3 thick planks salvaged from a fallen tree, hinged with leather straps. One day, as she was hauling a log, a sound made her freeze. It was a low whine. From the rim of the pit, 2 yellow eyes watched her. It was a dog, thin to the point of starvation, its ribs stark beneath a coat of gray, dusty fur. It was a stray, an outcast like herself. She held out a small piece of salt pork. The dog crept forward, snatched the offering, and retreated. She did this every day for a week. Slowly, the dog began to stay, first at the edge of the pit, then near her fire, until one night, as a cold rain fell, he crept inside her half-finished shelter and lay down by her feet, his body a small, warm furnace against the cold. She named him Shale, for the rock that gave them shelter. With the main structure complete, she made the trip back to Silver Creek. It was the first time she had been back in 2 months. She needed supplies she could not make: chickens, a milking goat, seeds for a winter garden. Leading Shale, who now followed her everywhere, she walked into Gable's mercantile. The men gathered around the stove fell silent. Thomas Gable looked up from his ledger, his eyes widening in disbelief. He had expected her to be gone or dead. He had not expected her to walk back into his store, her face weathered and her hands calloused, looking stronger and harder than he had ever seen her. "I need 4 laying hens, a nanny goat, and a bag of seed," she said, her voice steady. Her words hung in the thick air. Laughter broke the silence, a low chuckle from a trapper named Brant. "What for, girl? Gonna raise chickens in a rock pile?" Gable regained his composure. "That will be $20, he said, naming a price that was double the going rate. He thought to drive her away, to shame her. She met his gaze and placed her last 3 silver dollars on the counter, along with a small, heavy pouch. She opened it. Inside were a dozen small, dull yellow nuggets. Gold. She had found a small vein while digging out her foundation. It was not much, but it was enough. The laughter in the room died. Gable's eyes locked on the gold, his greed warring with his shock. He weighed the nuggets, his expression sour. He had cheated her out of a home, and she had returned and found gold on the worthless land he'd used to do it. The walk back was a strange procession. Ilara led a stubborn nanny goat on a rope, with a crate of clucking chickens strapped to her back. Shale trotted alongside, guarding his new, noisy flock. The people of Silver Creek watched her go, no longer with pity, but with a new, sharper mockery. The story of her purchase spread through the town like wildfire. They gave her a name, the Cave Girl. Her home became the Widow's Hole, or sometimes the Gravel Pit. It was a joke they told over mugs of ale, a story of a woman's foolishness in the face of hardship. They did not know she was building a world. Back in her shelter, she put her new assets to work. In the deepest, most protected corner of her dwelling, where the temperature was most stable, she built a small pen for the chickens and the goat. The animal's body heat would add to the warmth of the space. Beside the pen, she built 3 shallow, long boxes from scrap wood. She filled them with the dark, rich soil she found near the seep and planted her seeds: kale, carrots, turnips, hardy greens that could survive with minimal light. She would bring them out into the daylight when the weather allowed, but they would grow here, in the heart of the stone, a secret garden fed by the mountain's own water. The mockery from the town settled into a background hum, a thing she was aware of but no longer felt. Her world was the pit. It was the daily routine, a rhythm of survival that became its own kind of peace. In the morning, she would check her snare lines in the woods above the pit, hoping for a rabbit or a squirrel. Then she would milk the goat, collect the precious eggs from her hens, and water her small garden. The bulk of her day was spent cutting and stockpiling firewood. She knew the winter would be the true test, and she was determined to have a mountain of fuel. She stacked the wood against the outer stone wall of her shelter, creating yet another layer of insulation. Her world was small, but it was entirely her own. The warmth of the fire, the taste of fresh goat milk, the sound of Shale's breathing as he slept at her feet. These were the textures of her life. She was utterly alone, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of this small, carved-out kingdom of stone and wood. The town and its judgments felt a world away. They could have their laughter. She had the steady, radiating heat of the granite wall at her back. The first test came not from snow, but from water. An early autumn storm, a deluge of rain that lasted for 3 days, turned the hillsides into running mud. A torrent of water poured over the lip of the pit, threatening to flood her home. For a whole day and night, she worked in the driving rain, digging a deep trench along the upper edge of the pit to divert the flow. The cold water soaked her to the bone, and the mud was a treacherous, sucking mire. Shale barked frantically, sensing the danger. Finally, exhausted and covered in mud, she managed to channel the worst of the water around the sides of the pit. Her shelter remained dry. The system held. She learned from it, deepening the trench and reinforcing it with stones. She was not just surviving, she was adapting. As autumn deepened, the mockery took on a sharper edge. Brant, the trapper, made a point of passing by her land on his way to check his lines. He would stand on the rim of the pit and stare down at her work, a smirk on his face. "Getting ready to hibernate, cave girl?" he'd shout over the wind. "Better hope that pile of rocks don't fall in on you." She never answered. She just continued her work, her silence a wall he could not breach. His words were just noise, like the wind. They could not touch her here. The deep winter arrived. The first snows were light, dusting the mountains in a coat of white. Then the cold settled in, a deep, penetrating cold that locked the land in its grip. The creek in the valley froze solid. The world went quiet. For Ilara, this was when her systems truly came alive. Outside, the temperature dropped to 10 below zero, then 20. Inside her shelter, it was a different world. The great stone fireplace, fed with a slow, steady supply of seasoned wood, heated the massive granite wall behind it. The rock became a reservoir of heat, a gentle, constant warmth that filled the small space. It was never hot, but it was never cold. It was a stable, livable warmth, the kind of heat that seeped into your bones. Her days fell into a simple, peaceful routine. Tend the fire, milk the goat, feed the chickens, water the garden, check the snares. The world outside her door was a hostile wilderness of white, but inside there was life. Her greens grew slowly but steadily in their boxes, a vibrant, impossible splash of green in the monochrome winter. The chickens laid their eggs, the goat gave its milk. She had warmth, water, and food. She had built a small, functioning ecosystem, sealed away from the brutality of the season. Her world was the size of a single large room, but it was complete. Shale, her constant companion, seemed to know it too. He was calm and content, dozing by the fire, a silent guardian of their stone sanctuary. She had not just survived, she had created a place of peace. The town, with its mockery and its drafty log cabins, could have been on another planet. The first sign of the great storm was the sky. It turned a strange, bruised purple-gray, a color that seemed to absorb all light. The wind, always a presence on the hill, fell utterly silent. An unnatural stillness settled over the landscape, heavy and menacing. The animals grew restless. The chickens muttered nervously in their pen, and the goat stamped its feet. Shale stood at the door, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Ilara felt it too, a pressure in the air, a sense of something immense and terrible gathering its strength. She spent the entire day securing everything. She brought in a huge pile of firewood, stacked it high against the inner wall, and sealed the cracks around her door with strips of cloth and clay. She made sure the animal pens were secure and the cistern was full. Then she waited. It began not with a flurry, but with a single, deafening roar. The wind hit the hill like a physical blow, a solid wall of force that shrieked and howled. Then the snow came, not as flakes, but as a blinding, horizontal torrent of ice and white. The world outside her small window vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only the raging, chaotic blur of the blizzard. The sound was constant, a high-pitched scream mixed with a deep guttural moan as the storm tore through the trees. It was the sound of a world being ripped apart. Inside her shelter, it was astonishingly quiet. The earth and stone walls absorbed the sound, reducing the storm's fury to a distant, muffled rumble. The wind could not touch her. It raged over the top of the pit, but down here, in her burrow, the air was still. The fire in the great hearth burned steadily, its flames casting a warm, flickering light on the stone walls. The heat radiated from the granite behind it, a silent, powerful comfort. She sat on a stool, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of goat's milk, and listened. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. The town was wrong, all of them. This was not a hole in the ground. It was an anchor. For 3 days, the storm was relentless. It did not pause or weaken. It was a siege. Elara tended her small world. She milked the goat, collected the eggs, watered her shocking green plants. She cooked a stew of dried beans and salt pork. She read the one book she owned, a tattered copy of Shakespeare, its pages soft as cloth. She mended her clothes. Shale slept by the fire, occasionally lifting his head to listen to the muted roar, then settling back down with a sigh. The contrast was staggering. Outside, a battle for survival was being waged against a force of unimaginable power. Inside, there was order, warmth, and peace. She was a sailor in a calm harbor while a hurricane raged on the open sea. Down in Silver Creek, the storm was not a distant rumble. It was an invading army. The wind found every crack in their log cabins, driving needles of ice and snow into their homes. The snow piled up not in gentle drifts, but in massive, solid walls that buried windows and blocked doors. The weight was immense. On the second day, the roof of the livery stable collapsed with a sound like thunder, killing 2 horses. The sound of splintering wood became common as porches and sheds gave way. Families huddled around their fireplaces, feeding them constantly, but the heat was sucked away by the drafts as fast as it was produced. Their carefully stacked wood piles, left outside, were buried under 10 feet of snow. Panic began to set in. Mr. Davies, the rancher, lost half his herd, frozen solid in their pens. The meeting hall, the town's designated emergency shelter, began to fail. A great crack appeared in the main support beam under the weight of the snow on its roof. Inside the Gable home, the cold was a predator. Despite a roaring fire, frost coated the inside of the windows. Thomas Gable's wife, Mary, huddled under a mountain of quilts with their 7-year-old son, Daniel. The boy was sick. A fever had taken hold before the storm, and now it was worsening. His breathing was a shallow, ragged rasp. The cough syrup was gone, and the fire was consuming their firewood at an alarming rate. Thomas looked at the wood box. It was nearly empty. The main pile was outside, under a mountain of snow he could not possibly dig through. On the 3rd night, Daniel's breathing became a desperate struggle. His lips were tinged with blue. Mary looked at her husband, her eyes wide with terror. "He's not going to make it, Thomas. He's freezing. The fire is dying." Desperation broke through Thomas Gable's pride like a hammer through ice. He thought of everyone in town, trapped in their own failing shelters. There was no help to be had. And then an impossible thought surfaced. The woman in the gravel pit, the fool, the outcast. He had imagined her frozen in her hovel, But what if he was wrong? What if that ridiculous pile of rocks and dirt had actually worked? It was a mad hope, a straw to a drowning man, but it was all he had. He pulled on every piece of clothing he owned, wrapped a scarf over his face, and took up a lantern. "I'm going out," he told his wife. "Where?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "To get help." He did not say from whom. He could not bring himself to speak the name. He forced his way out the back door, into the screaming chaos of the blizzard. The cold was a physical shock, stealing the air from his lungs. The wind knocked him to his knees. He began the impossible journey up Hangman's Hill, guided by a desperate, insane flicker of hope. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore at him, and the snow was a thick, suffocating blanket. He could not see more than 2 feet in front of him. He fell a dozen times, the lantern extinguishing, plunging him into a disorienting world of white and roaring black. He navigated by memory, by the slope of the land, by pure instinct. He was a pillar of pride, the most respected merchant in Silver Creek, and now he was crawling on his hands and knees through a frozen hell, begging for his life. All he could think of was his son's face, pale and still. He almost missed it. He was ready to give up, to lie down and let the snow take him, when a shape loomed out of the swirling white. It was not a cabin, it was a mound of earth, a slight rise in the landscape, with a single thin curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney, miraculously undispersed by the gale. He stumbled toward it, his legs numb, his mind failing. He found the door, a solid plank construction, almost invisible against the stone and earth. He raised a frozen fist and banged on it, a weak, desperate drumming. He banged again and then collapsed, his strength gone. The door swung open. A wave of warm, clean air washed over him, smelling of wood smoke, baked bread, and damp earth. Elara stood there, holding a lantern. Behind her the space was lit by the gentle glow of the fire. It was not a cave. It was a home. Thomas Gable stared, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The walls were smooth stone and log. A small garden of green plants grew in a box near the fire. He could hear the soft clucking of chickens. A goat looked at him from a clean straw-filled pen. The air was warm, still, and dry. It was impossible. He tried to speak, but his frozen lips would not form the words. He could only gesture, a desperate, pleading motion, back down the hill. Elara looked at his frost-covered face, at the terror in his eyes. There was no flicker of triumph in her expression, no hint of, "I told you so." Her face was calm, her gaze direct. She looked past him, to the dog, Shale, who stood beside her, his tail giving a slow, questioning thump. "Shale," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Go with him, show him the way back, then bring me." She turned and disappeared back inside for a moment, emerging with a thick wool blanket and a small, tightly wrapped package. She pressed them into his numb hands. For the boy, a poultice for his chest, keep him warm. Gable could only nod, tears freezing on his cheeks. He turned and stumbled back into the storm, but this time he was not alone. The gray dog trotted ahead of him, a steady, ghostly shape in the blizzard, leading him back to the town that had failed him, away from the shelter that had not. Elara watched them go, then banked her fire, pulled on a heavy coat, and prepared to follow. She had to ration her firewood, her food, her strength. This man, who had cast her out, was now asking her to risk it all for him. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a simple matter of fact. A child was dying. She would go. She loaded a small sled with firewood, blankets, and a kettle of hot broth. She would risk her own safety for the son of the man who had left her with nothing but a worthless hole in the ground. When Gable stumbled back into his own freezing house, his wife cried out. He was covered in snow, his face raw, but he was alive, and he carried a blanket that felt warm to the touch. Shale followed him in, shaking the snow from his coat, and immediately lying down by the hearth as if he belonged there. Gable unwrapped the poultice, a warm, fragrant mixture of herbs and lard, and placed it on his son's chest. He covered the boy with a thick, dry blanket. He did not know what to say, how to explain the miracle he had just witnessed. An hour later, a heavy knock came at the door. It was Alara. She pulled a sled behind her, laden with firewood. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her face grim with purpose. She did not look at Gable. She went straight to the boy, felt his forehead, and listened to his breathing. Then she went to the fireplace and began expertly building up the fire with the wood she had brought, creating a core of heat that pushed back the oppressive cold. She heated the broth and helped Mary coax a few spoonfuls into Daniel. Gable stood by the wall, a useless spectator in his own home. He watched this woman, this cave girl he had mocked and dismissed, move with a competence that shamed him. He looked at the warmth spreading from the fire, at the life she had brought into the room. He saw the impossible truth. He had built his life on wood and commerce and the good opinion of others. She had built hers on stone and earth and self-reliance. When the test came, his world had crumbled. Hers had held. He finally found his voice. It was a hoarse, broken whisper. "We were wrong," he said. The words fell into the quiet room, heavy as stones. "We called you a fool." My God, we were the fools. Alara paused in her work, her back to him. She did not turn around. She simply said, "The boy needs warmth. Keep the fire steady." There was no anger in her voice, no accusation. There was only the task at hand. Her grace was more damning than any rebuke. It stripped him of his pride, leaving only a raw, painful humility. She did not need his apology. She did not need his validation. She was beyond it. She stayed through the night, tending to the boy and the fire. By morning, the blizzard's fury had lessened, and Daniel's fever had broken. His breathing was easier. Alara prepared to leave. She looked at Mary Gable, who was weeping silently with relief. "He will be well," she said. "Keep him warm." She turned to go. Gable blocked her path. "Take anything," he said, gesturing around the room, at the furniture, the goods he had spent a lifetime accumulating. "Anything you want. It's yours." Alara looked at him, her gaze meeting his for the first time. "I have everything I need, Mr. Gable." She stepped around him and walked out the door into the dawn of a new white world, her dog trotting faithfully at her heels. She left behind a stunned silence and the lingering scent of wood smoke and herbs. She had not come for revenge or reward. She had come to save a child, that was all. When the storm finally broke, the world was remade. Silver Creek was a landscape of immense, sculpted drifts, its buildings half buried. The survivors emerged slowly, blinking in the bright, cold sun. The stories began to spread. The story of the Gables' son, the story of the woman who had walked through the heart of the blizzard with firewood on her back, the story of the shelter that had held when everything else had broken. A small group of men, led by Thomas Gable and the trapper Brant, made their way up the hill. They were not going to mock. They were going to see. When they stood on the rim of the pit, they fell silent. Below them was not a scene of ruin, but of life. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. The tracks of a woman and a dog led from the door into the woods and back. The shelter itself looked like part of the hill, solid and permanent. It had not fought the storm. It had accepted it, and in doing so, had defeated it. Over the next weeks, the town's relationship with Alara transformed. They came to her not with pity, but with respect. They came to trade. Mrs. Davies brought a side of beef in exchange for a basket of fresh winter greens from Alara's impossible garden. Brant, the trapper, traded beaver pelts for a sack of her root vegetables, his eyes full of a new, humbled understanding. The name the gravel pit was still used, but now it was spoken with a kind of awe. It was no longer an insult. It was a title. Alara did not change. She remained quiet, reserved. She shared what she had. She taught what she knew when asked. She showed them how the thermal mass of the stone held the heat, how the earth-sheltered walls defeated the wind. Men who had spent their lives building with logs now looked at the earth and the rock with new eyes. The following spring, the new wing on the meeting hall was built her way, dug into the hillside with thick stone walls and an earth roof. They were learning. Her story became a quiet legend, a cornerstone of the town's identity. Travelers passing through would hear about the great blizzard of '83 and the woman who survived it, the woman who had fed the town from a hole in the ground. They would point to the hill and talk about her not as a fool, but as a founder, a figure of quiet strength. Her legacy was not written in books or carved on monuments. It was written in the stone and soil of the land itself. It was in the design of the new homes, in the winter pantries stocked with preserved greens, in the quiet understanding that the most valuable things are not always the things that shine. Years passed. Ilara lived out her days in the gravel pit, her world small but complete. She never sought the approval of the town she had saved, but she had it all the same. She would sometimes stand at the edge of her shelter in the evening, with Shale's descendants at her side, and look down at the lights of Silver Creek. She had been cast out, left with nothing but a worthless piece of land. But from that rock she had built a life. From their scorn she had forged a legacy. She had learned the great lesson of the mountains, that true strength is not in standing against the storm, but in finding the shelter that was already there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the eyes to see it.